G'day, and welcome to another Alternate History with Mates video, and today we're exploring the fascinating alternate history of what if the US had won the Vietnam War. Now we'll be mainly focusing on how this would have occurred, not just a simple wave of the wand. So we're focusing mainly on how the war could have been won. That's what this alternate history is mainly about today, and the second video will be about the world, how it would have changed with a Vietnam that wasn't communist. This will be organized firstly, in a set of criteria for how this war could have been won. The common explanations many alternate histories give for how this war just magically ends, because that's usually the solution. But none of these changes are usually very realistic. So let's go into the first one. The most common one, obviously, is that the war needs to end before 1968. This is a common thing in alternate histories, that it just needs to end before that. And of course, that's the same in this alternate history, because 1968 was a massive year for the world, for Vietnam, for the United States, which changed it forever. The year of 68 was the year of the Tet Offensive, the My Lai massacre, events which would change the United States forever, leading to an increase of the countercultural revolution, massive social unrest, which culminates in things like the Kent State shootings in Mississippi, the drug epidemic, crime. Many things happened because of the atrocities of the year and the shocks of the year that changed the United States forever. And we can see the effects of this in the modern day. Look at the United States now, with lack of trust in the government, the polarization which began in that age. All these things we can see came from this year. So 68 is a year which we don't want to reach. Firstly though, why principally couldn't the war last longer than 68? Well, if we look at all of the US's popular honorable wars, they haven't lasted longer than 3 years. The wars that that are looked on favorably in the United States, such as World War II, which lasted for 3 years of US involvement. World War I had 2 years of US involvement, and then Korea only lasted 3 years. But we can even see in the Korean War that there began to be an anti-war movement after the first year of involvement. And so we can see in the wars that are looked unfavorably on, well, the Vietnam War went on for ages. It went on from about 1965, from the first US Marines that were landed, to 1973. So the US has no stomach for long wars. Or look at Afghanistan. That was initially supported just like Vietnam, but as the years went on, it became more and more unfavorable. The simple fact is that the American public never has had the stomach for long wars, no matter how we change this. Therefore, the war just simply has to end by 68. We could add to this a little bit more, mitigate some of the effects, such as in Vietnam, particularly that war, there was the brutal televisation of the war, which showed all the atrocities and violence of the war and brought it back into the homes of the American public. If the US had censored the media more, maybe they could have bought an extra year. But it's hard to achieve this realistically, this censorship, and it's also wouldn't buy that much time, given Korea wasn't as televised and still got a massive anti-war movement. So given that we want to change it the littlest possible in this scenario and have the highest chance of success, the war needs to end by 68, and we can't just have a simple fix of censoring the media. So as I've established, in this video we're not just going to end the war early. So let's look on to the second criteria, the second thing that commonly gets put forward as the magic wand that will end the Vietnam War, and let's look at it. So the second option is that the Americans would invade North Vietnam, and this is an obvious solution. For anyone that's studied or looked at Vietnam in any detail, you can see that invading North Vietnam would have been quite crucial and vital for the Americans to ever win the war, and could have been an easy, simple fix, because this would have eliminated the constant border that the South suffered from, which was giving them the infiltration of Viet Cong were able to infiltrate through the northern border, the NVA infiltration, the constant base where the Viet Cong could run and hide to while they chose when to attack. This is important, because what this meant, that they always had this safe base in the north. It meant that the Viet Cong could always have the initiative. They could always choose where the battles were fought and when they could fight the battles, and when they needed to fight the battles, when it was beneficial, because If they'd lost a lot of men, well, they could just go and hide in North Vietnam and recuperate strength, whereas the US was constantly in the battlefield and could never choose when to fight. This was very negative, as the Americans constantly, killed the Viet Cong, right? But then they just kept back because they couldn't kill it at the source, which was very crucial to ever winning the war. And look, we can compare this to other wars as examples of nations that have been able to defeat a communist uprising. Let's look at the Malayan crisis, where the British, well, we can see they succeeded because there was no communist border where the Malayan rebels could run to and hide. Or let's look at the Philippines, same situation. In this context, the Americans actually won and defeated the Hulk communist rebels. And in South Korea, that also had a communist guerrilla. And as soon as after the Korean War, when the DMZ was created and it was a solid border, the communist guerrillas stopped because the South Koreans were able to manage the guerrillas by just killing them all because there was no base that they could run to. They were all able to successfully crack down. And this is something that would have happened if they could have been able to invade the North, get rid of the backer who's giving them the guns, who's giving them the safe bases. However, this just isn't historically accurate. There's no way this could have happened without just doing the magic wand, as I like to call it. And we don't want to change that much, because in the context, the Americans were absolutely terrified of Chinese retribution, of the Chinese pulling at Korea and invading, something they didn't want to happen again after the massively deadly Korean conflict, which claimed 2.5 million lives and around 55,000 American soldiers. Therefore, it's just unrealistic for the Americans to have ever invaded the North, although that would have won the war. Well, the next criteria we have is that we need to reform the government, and we need to improve and also reform the Arvn, which is the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Now, this is something we can actually achieve by this timeline without changing too much. However, it's something that usually most alternate historians will just wave over, that somehow a general magically does this. This just happens to make it realistic. Well, we can actually do this solidly. But first, let's just look at the ARVN in our timeline, which actually got notably much better and had improved by the late 60s and early 70s in our timeline. Great examples are the Battle of Hue, which they retook the citadel and fought with great vigor and honor. The Christmas Offensive of 72, in which they successfully withstood the Viet Cong and NVA assaults. And also we can just look at how they managed to hold off for 2 years after the Americans had left without actual American air power, which was very significant, whereas the Viet Cong were getting stuff from the Soviets, the Chinese. However, they weren't ever good enough, although the media and historical narrative often does portray them much more negatively and as cowards than what they actually were, where many had great bravery and grit, as many veterans of the wars from countries like America and Australia can attest to. The problems with the ARVN were that they were significantly let down by endemic corruption inside the leadership of the units and inside the government. There was also significant infiltration by the enemy, and that's also down to a lack of coordination and effectiveness by the government. There weren't any real great military leaders, that's down to really the inherent lack of experience the ARVN had, because South Vietnam was a new country. It was a new army. Many of them hadn't served in an army before, so they were novices, right? And this is really not the same as the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, who could draw on a wealth of experience enjoyed by the veterans of guerrilla campaigns against the Japanese, the French, the Americans now, and the Vietnamese. So the North Vietnamese had more skill and more experience. These problems, again, as we know, are hard to change, especially given the profuseness of corruption and these endemic problems in the Vietnamese government. However, as you will see in a second, I've got a solution for this. But let's quickly talk about the second issue here, which is that the Vietnam government needs to get good, right? It needs to be better. And that's really a nigh impossible task, It's the South Vietnamese government and competency, well, they're kind of antonyms, really. But there is a way. There is a way to end the stagnation of dictators such as Chu and the constant coups that kept on happening. There is one way. It's the flip. I'll be honest. It's a bit flimsy, but as you'll see and as I'll argue, it may just be the solution. It may be the solution to the corruption that was everywhere. So with all that left, you're probably wondering, is this guy just an idiot? What's he got coming up his sleeve? Well, I'll tell you. Today, I'm making the case for Ngo Dinh Diem, the man who led Vietnam from 1955 to 1963 until he was assassinated by a US authorized coup. Now, they didn't conduct the coup, they didn't give it arms, but they did give it the go-ahead and gave the leaders of the coup a little nudge saying, why don't you get rid of Diem? So, what did this lead to? The assassination of Diem? It led to a downward spiral of political instability and unrest, which could never be solved. South Vietnam's decay went terminal after the assassination of Diem. What's my main evidence of support? Well, I'll be using a comparative to South Korea, which is quite useful. And South Korea was led by Syngman Rhee, who was also a fellow dictator, a dictator who masqueraded himself as a democrat. He managed to stabilize South Korea and prevent a communist ascendancy. And given the common similarities between Syngman Rhee, notwithstanding both of them had a Christian faith, which is kind of interesting, there's a lot of interesting similarities between the two. And I believe that given Syngman Rhee's success, I can make a solid argument for Diem. What's the main reason behind why Syngman and Diem, I believe, are successful, and why Rhee definitely was successful? Well, I believe the main reason for this is the inherent violence needed to suppress a communist insurgency. Now, Rhee killed and tortured hundreds of thousands of communists or suspected communists during, before, and after the Korean War. Not many people actually realize that there was actually insurgency/civil war in South Korea before the Korean War during 1948, around then 1949, which Rhee successfully crushed by basically killing them all. You can see that in South Vietnam as the years got on, especially in 1960 upwards. We could see that Diem was systematically wiping out all the communists, killing them, torturing them, wiping out all the enemies, like he purged Saigon of all the gangsters. So we can imagine that if we'd given Diem some more time, he would have got to work and killed a lot of them now. This is quite brutal, but this is the kind of thing that leads to a successful stabilization of these kind of regimes, as we know historically. If he had been able to stabilize Vietnam and wipe out as more communists and basically suppress recruitment. So, what are the benefits of Diem's regime that are similar to Rhee's? Well, firstly, we wouldn't have a disintegration of the Can Lao Party, which were the secret police which had been keeping order in the regime and conducting the brutal but necessary purges and repressions in the country necessary for rule. In addition, Diem had benefits such as his elimination of crime in Saigon, which I've already touched on, and this was a constant thorn in future administrations of South Vietnam and of US military police, such as South Vietnam's drug epidemic, which happened where they were selling lots of drugs to US soldiers, which lowered morale. So this could be avoided, as the mafia would not have been able to grow back if Diem had retained control. In addition, it can be argued that he cared more about making a strong South Vietnam than his successors who were just grabbing power, right? There are elements of nationalism and of genuine service in there. We can also look at his economic policies, which weren't always successful but can be argued to be necessary, such as land redistribution, economic reforms such as things with farming and redistribution of it, his development of many universities in the cities. Now, look, his efforts in the countryside and these land reforms, they didn't exactly work, such as strategic hamlets is a great example, which alienated those countryside people, the rural people. However, his persecution of them generally kept them in check, and in addition, he was genuinely quite effective in the city with his development of universities, industry, commerce. He was good there. So look, he may or may not have been the greatest in the countryside, but definitely in the cities he would have strengthened Vietnam's economy. And we don't know. Maybe if these reforms had been left to go, they might have worked. However, at the end of the day, he did have one weakness. He had many weaknesses, but he had one big weakness. One big weakness that got him killed, that got him shot, that got him blown up. Whatever happened to him, he died because of this weakness, and that weakness was that he only had, for a lot of the time, the support of 10% of the country. That was the Catholics, because he was a big Catholic. He was a big Catholic supporter, putting the Catholics above the Buddhists. And this was a problem because Vietnam was a majority Buddhist country, 90% in fact. So it's not exactly the smartest idea to, attack the majority. Buddhist crisis, which occurred between May and November 1963. This brings to mind things like the self-immolation of monks, and the international outrage that followed this really unveiled the shroud that the Diem regime was really stable, and also that it was democratic. This was really destroyed by the Buddhist crisis. Now, without this crisis, Diem would not have been assassinated because there wouldn't be the trigger that led to his downfall, that led to him being painted as being a very horrible person and taking off the cloak of what he was. To prevent this crisis, we can change history in the least possible way. We can win the Vietnam War by changing one thing. You may say it's a bit flimsy, but let's just say Diem was slightly more moderate, just slightly, and decided he would not ban the Buddhist flag. Wow! That's random, you're probably thinking. And do you know what? I'd reply with a yes, it is random, but it's bloody true. What precipitated the Buddhist crisis was the shooting of 9 unarmed citizens, the Hugh Pratt Dan shooting, and these people were protesting the banning of the Buddhist flag. So yes, if he was a bit more moderate and just decided not to ban the flag, he wouldn't have died, the crisis wouldn't have happened, the protest wouldn't have happened, the shooting wouldn't have happened. And if we're saying he's a bit more moderate, that's going to just lower the tension significantly. So let's say the peace does last. Well, then we've got Diem for the war. And importantly, we've got a much more stable regime. The crisis being very destructive to the regime and driving Viet Cong recruitment among Buddhists. We've got the continued elimination of communist sympathizers with Diem being in power. That's preventing the guerrilla growth. We've got stable political rule under Diem, which is very important because that instability was really a major factor in why the Americans could never hold Vietnam, because there was nothing to hold it with. We also have the Can Lao Party, which was the secret police under Diem's brother Nhu, who could keep the country together, keep spying on everyone, just getting at those communists, not letting them grow. We have the many ministries and government bodies which would be intact and not as corrupt, as they wouldn't have fallen apart after Diem's fall and the various coups. Sure, we have the personalism and familiarism, the family dictatorship under Diem, which was definitely corrupt, but it's not as corrupt as, what followed. And what we would also have would be a better Arvn without the constant military leadership changes and adventurism of the higher-ups, each vying for control of the country. And a stable state generally would lead to better leadership, better training, and also we'd have definitely is the elite loyal special forces that Diem and Nhu were cultivating. So that would be very useful for operations and controlling resistance. And we also have something finally very important, imaging. Without the Buddhist crisis and Diem's assassination, South Vietnam would look much more stable to both its enemies, reducing the northern Vietnamese ambitions on South Vietnam, and it would also make the American public support the regime more, as it would appear more of a democracy without the unveiling of the Buddhist crisis, and it would make it more legitimate, thus being supported. So we can buy some more years in the war, and also some more morale from the troops. It wouldn't feel like an unjust war. It would feel like American men are dying for something, for democracy. Now, with a generally more stable regime, leadership, institutionalized way of hunting down the opposition, the war would take on an entirely different facet. Firstly, it would become more clearly an NVA invasion, rather than popular uprising by the Viet Cong, as Diem would have crushed a lot of the opposition just like Syngman Rhee, more effectively. This means international involvement would have been more supportive of the US involvement and would have actually existed, and US support in the country would have been higher, because they would have just seen it like Korean War 2.0, another second country invading the Southern Democratic one, which would have, just like Korea, raised fears about East Berlin invading West Berlin and part of a wider World War III. The same would have occurred here, especially given its timeline, proximity to the Korean War. So, in addition, we have a stable state, and without the guerrillas there, the fighting would be more conventional. This means that the US would absolutely trounce the Viet Cong, as we saw in any conventional battle between the Americans and the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong got smashed, died in millions. And a great example of this is the Tet Offensive, which the Americans absolutely smashed the conventional attacks of the Viet Cong. Additionally, Diem was much more of a leader, rather than just the guy in charge, the chap just sitting in the big office with the big royal palace, That means that he'd have better economic management. Given his track record, it's much better than those succeeding him. He's actually going to be an active leader, which is a great thing to have. And we can also see him crushing the Ho Chi Minh Trail, something that only the South Vietnamese could do. So, in our timeline, his brother Nhu tried to assassinate Sihanouk, who was the Cambodian leader, with a mail bomb. Now, what this points out is that Diem and his brother were willing to interfere with the fellow Indochina countries to try and get their goals, right? Which means with this aggressive foreign policy, we can imagine that Diem wouldn't have hesitated from invading parts of Laos and Cambodia to secure the Ho Chi Minh Trail, something the Americans would never have done. So, because it would have just been bad for public image, but the Arvn definitely could have done that. We can also see this in this world, that the South would have much more advantages, and so would American involvement. So, ultimately, the victory would happen. The Americans and the Vietnamese would win, and it would likely be a negotiated peace in 1967. So, the Vietnamese would fight conventionally for about a year, and then they'd get trounced and go back and realize they couldn't win. Especially with Americans would be much more willing to bomb cities such as Hanoi and industrial targets, given this was more of a direct invasion from the north. So it would be Rolling Thunder times 100, right? So this would definitely encourage the Vietnamese to surrender, especially given in our timeline the Rolling Thunder bombings nearly took them to the limit, and the American kill rate also did too. So imagine an increase of both of these factors would push the North Vietnamese over the edge, and they wouldn't see South Vietnam as an easy target anymore. Thus, we have achieved a world in which the US wins South Vietnam, and we don't have the tragedies, we don't have all the social impacts that happened because of American loss, which I will talk about in my next video. To stay tuned for video 2 exploring this alternate world and the effects of this scenario. So quickly, let me just summarize what's happened and how it's happened. So essentially, the important factor in the Vietnam War by the Americans' loss is, I believe, is the lack of the stable South Vietnamese government, which could effectively control the countrysides and get rid of the guerrillas. Now, by implementing Diem, who was successful in our timeline of doing this, by not having him assassinated, we can get rid of this guerrillas, we can stabilize the country, have a stable government, and this is really important in Vietnam ever having been won. Because at the end of the day, sure, the Americans could always win and beat back the North Vietnamese tide, but they never had something to actually build. And with Diem, they have something to build that wall that will keep the country together, I guess. So thank you for listening. Stay tuned for part 2.